Good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the Fifth Estate here at the Wheeler Centre. My name is Sally Warhaft. It's a tremendous pleasure to be inviting Gareth Evans back here this evening. He's been a guest before on this series, and of course before he did that, he was a former Cabinet Minister in the Keating and Hawke governments for 13 years, one of the two longest serving in Labor Party history. Anybody just want to yell out loud who they think the other one is? It's a Trivial Pursuit question in Gareth's book. No. Keep trying. He served as Attorney General, Minister for Resources and Energy, Transport and Communications, and of course, Foreign Affairs. Gareth retired after 21 years in the Federal Parliament and went on to lead the Brussels-based International Crisis Group from 2000 to 2009. And since 2010, he's been the Chancellor and Honorary Professorial Fellow of the ANU. And on top of all that, a prolific author, writing and editing 13 books on international relations, government, legal, constitutional reform. And his new memoir is this wonderful book, Incorrigible Optimist. Please give him a warm welcome. Gareth, I want to start with this word incorrigible, which means beyond change or reform, which of course you know. And I want to I want to put it to you that you're being rather inflexible in your optimism.
Well, always looking on the bright side does, as I've often said, lend itself to parody, as fans of Monty Python hardly need reminding. And you do sometimes feel a bit of a goose when you look at the world around you and say, how could there possibly be any silver lining in any of that? But for two reasons, I think. I have always been and will remain an optimist when it comes to public policy sorts of issues. The first reason is when you look at a lot of these things, particularly in a historical perspective, there is reason to be a little bit more comfortable than is the case when you just look at events in isolation. The trends over human history in terms of conflict, human rights, atrocity crimes and so on have really been all pretty much down. And for each of the current situations out there that look intractable, look horrible, both internationally and domestically, there's always something somewhere you can identify which is worth hanging a hat on as a possible way out of the mess. So objectively, there's stuff out there. But the other point is really this, that I think from my own sort of experience and instinct, if you approach life as a pessimist, it's pretty self-defeating. It's self-reinforcing in the sense that you're deeply reluctant to ever take any initiatives about anything. You just want to pull the covers over your head and say, well, whatever I do is not going to make any difference. If you're an optimist, you're always got some kind of sense of belief that something you do might just make a difference. And as I quote right at the beginning from that French novel of a couple of years ago, that wonderful line, it's sort of better to live life as a pessimist and periodically be proved wrong than to live life as an optimist and periodically be proved wrong than to live as a pessimist and always be right. So,
we might come back to this.
Yeah,
it's
still getting warmed up.
It's pretty hard to spend money on a book called Incorrigible Pessimism, right? I'm damn sure of that. Well, look, then let's see if we can really get that optimism out of you, Gareth. You were last here at the Fifth Estate I think it was a week after the Republican convention, so a couple of months before the US elections last year, and this is what you said. I don't think Donald Trump is going to be winning any awards for thinking anytime soon. If you want a sexist, racist ignoramus, Donald Trump's your man. If you want someone who's going to career around the world like a crazed adolescent, ripping apart all the structures and all the institutions which are giving the world such little stability as it now has, Donald Trump is your man. So God knows whether he will actually succeed. It can't be assumed that he won't. It absolutely cannot be assumed. Unless Hillary Clinton can lift her game and start connecting in a way that she manifestly hasn't been able to do so far, then we could be in for quite a lot of strife. It was prophetic. I mean, that was as good as anyone in the world got, I think. It deserves a round of applause.
And the trouble is, it's sort of got worse. I mean, as demonstrated by the way in which, even people very close to the presidency in the Republican system are now coming out. I mean, Bob Corker's remarked today that the White House is like an adult daycare centre where the staff have gone missing. I'd also have to say that Tillerson's effing moron line has to rank as the most implausible denial in recent modern history. I mean, this guy is beyond parody, and therein does lie a problem. The only reason for any residual optimism at all is that the pushback factor is working very, very strongly with the Republicans and others just in Congress demonstrating that even with a majority, they're not able or willing to deliver on the crazier manifestations of Trump's program. And there are some adults around him when it comes to foreign and defence policy. And I think the notion that, simply by Trump using the biscuit or pushing the button can start a nuclear war without any kind of compensating pushback in the system, I think that's extremely unlikely.
Extremely unlikely is still extremely scary, though, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
You actually would know the answer to this question. How does Trump go about pushing that button if he decides he wants to? What are the things that happen?
Well, first of all, he has to find his biscuit. That's a little plastic thing with a code on it.
Bill Clinton lost his, didn't he, for a while?
Clinton lost his, as I suggest in my diary. I mean, he was in the habit of mislaying his trousers, so it was sort of fairly understandable that he lost his biscuit as well. But that was, the situation never arose when it was remotely plausible this would be necessary. Obviously, it has arisen in the context of Trump's crazed rhetoric on the North Korean issue. But if he technically, the tradition is absolutely clear, and the law is absolutely clear about civilian command of the military, and if the president sets that motion in train through the sequence of buttons that do have to be pressed with that football thing they carry around, the briefcase, then notionally, people down the line just have to obey the signals. But I think the reality is, we're now starting to see articles saying that people would be guilty of war crimes if they, as in Nuremberg trials and so on, if they were to do this. I think there's so much reservation, there is so much instinctive anxiety in the most senior levels of the military about this guy that, this is not a comfortable scenario, but it's one that I think we can be reasonably confident it won't go completely off the rails.
And at a more realistic level then, what are the sort of depths of the strife that he's causing internationally? With foreign affairs as you knew it.
Well, I mean, America has just abdicated global leadership on global public goods issues. I mean, June this year was a watershed, walking away from the climate thing. There's absolute despair internationally at senior levels. I mean, most people are reasonably polite about it publicly, but absolute despair. American soft power, which was the great thing that America was always able to do, the sort of the values of the system, and the way in which, the light on the American hill was something to be aspired to by most of the world's people. That has just collapsed. It's collapsed dramatically. There's evidence of this everywhere. I was in South Korea recently, just a few weeks ago, and talking about, obviously, the nuclear issue. And an opinion poll came out when I was there, which said that 65% of South Koreans thought that the biggest risk of a war being triggered was Donald Trump. 35% said it was North Korea, it was Kim Jong-un. And this is the kind of atmosphere that's around the place. I mean, it's just, American diplomats I know are almost, to a person, inconsolable about to the extent there are any diplomats left, because Tillerson hasn't been appointing ambassadors and Trump hasn't been doing it either. So there is a sense of decay and despair, and in an environment where, decent sort of leadership on these big issues has never been more necessary, it's gone missing.
In Australia, we see Julie Bishop having to make statements where, she has to say his name out loud in, sentences that are meant to mean something. And I just feel so sorry for her, really. having to, and I think she's doing it really well, and I imagine that's the job, isn't it? But what would be going on behind the scenes?
Well, not quite enough, in my judgment. Not enough pushback. I mean, the sort of rhetoric we're joined at the hip, which you're getting constantly from Malcolm Turnbull, the absolute unwillingness of Julie, who's a very good transactional foreign minister, not a brilliantly creative one, but a good transactional one. Her unwillingness to even sort of hint at, difficulty, disagreement, being super, super polite. I think they're overdoing it. My view has always been about the alliance, even at the high points of the relationship, that a little bit of pushback and a little bit of manifest unwillingness to agree to follow the Americans down every rabbit hole, every cul-de-sac, is something that's good for not only the soul as an independent country, but actually means that you're taken much more seriously by the Americans. And I give the example in the book of what to me is the clearest indication that a show of independence in the way you conduct your foreign policy, not going along with American directions on most favoured nation status for China or whatever the issue is, can actually serve you well. The story is in the context of the Chemical Weapons Convention back in the early 90s, which had been stuck in a Geneva United Nations negotiation for the previous 20 years. Everybody wanted something to happen, but it was just immovable. Jim Baker, the US Secretary of State, called me up one day and said, look, you want this to move, we want this to move, it is stuck, but we're too big and ugly to be able to unstick it. You guys have been driving us nuts recently with shows of, this is almost his words, shows of independence and a whole variety of issues, and you're clearly not going to be seen as our patsy on this issue. Can you please pick up the running, initiate what we'd like you to do first up is convene a big international conference of all the relevant government and industry players and try and cut through this impasse. We think you guys have got the credibility to do just that. And it was exactly because we had been making life difficult on the Test Ban Treaty, on sanctions for South Africa, on China's status, MFN and so on. It was because we've been making life difficult and not being just the pink tummy exposed, four paws waving, tongue lolling acolyte that is the favoured stance for many Australian governments. We were able to deliver very good results.
That sort of puppy image, though, is Trump might kick puppies, mightn't he?
Well, he doesn't grab them, I guess.
You write in the book about nuclear weapons, and it's been throughout your adult life a huge ongoing interest that old-fashioned advocacy won't work in restraining the proliferation and stopping the use of nuclear weapons. It's a top-down approach. It's something that requires supple, intelligent leaders. Now, you worked at the time of some of the greatest political, Yitzhak Rabin, Mikhail Gorbachev, and I can understand why that would cultivate a young adult optimism in you. But now you look at Netanyahu, Putin, Trump, and it just seems the world is being cornered by men who just don't want peace, or they want a lot of other things first.
Yeah, well, I mean, the nuclear issue is one on which I'm less optimistic than most other topics.
Well, that's really terrifying.
Yeah, as compared with where I was and where I think we all were at the beginning of the Obama regime, when, for the first time we had a US president who was both emotionally and intellectually engaged with the issue of disarmament, thought we just had to get there. And we were making sort of considerable strides until, things went haywire. But, it's not just top-down, it is bottom-up, and the kind of the ICAN movement, the Nobel Prize, the nuclear ban treaty that's been negotiated, even though they're quixotic enterprises from many points of view, they do create a normative environment which is at least a necessary condition, if not a sufficient condition, for something happening. And I think now that people have been a little bit shaken by the events in North Korea and have come to realise the good sense of that line in the Canberra Commission report, which we initiated back in '96, that so long as anyone has nuclear weapons, others will want them. And then the rest of the mantra, so long as anyone has them, they're bound one day to be used, if not deliberately, then by accident, system error, human idiocy or whatever. And that third part of the mantra, that any such use is likely to be catastrophic for life on this planet as we know it. I think, that normative understanding is out there. We've now ignored it for a while. The Russia-US negotiation has gone off the boil and it's not going to resume anytime soon with these guys. But nonetheless, the underlying necessity to do something to get off this danger zone, get out of this danger zone is very real. And I'm not entirely pessimistic. But what you've got to do is not hang your hat just on the absolutes. You've got to work towards a systematic step-by-step agenda of the kind that we proposed in the other commission report that I was involved in, that Kevin Rudd initiated with me and the Japanese former foreign minister co-chairing it, in which we said the crucial first step was to get to a minimisation agenda, a massive reduction in numbers deployed, getting weapons off alert and getting people signed up to no first use. That is not unachievable in a 20-year time frame, but we are going to have a bit more sense at the top than is being demonstrated by the kind of guys you mentioned.
I'm going to quote another Gareth Evans line, but this time from Incorrigible Optimist. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be Foreign Minister was very heaven. It has got to be the best job, doesn't it, in this country, to be Foreign Minister?
Yeah, I think it is, because it takes you away from the day-to-day.
From your colleagues.
the day-to-day crap of domestic politics, and by and large, there's a little bit of a disposition to have more bipartisan approach to it. I mean,
well, considerably, really, isn't it?
Yeah, but within carefully defined limits of the kind that we're seeing at the moment,
yeah,
and the reactions to China and the US and so on. But yeah, basically you're operating where what matters far more than politics is policy, just by the nature of the subject matter, because there's not enough wider community interest in most foreign policy issues to stir the loins of the politicos, and they basically just let you get on with it. And provided you've got a decent relationship with your Prime Minister and not opening up fronts of manifest disagreement, you can just get on with it. And that was an incredibly exciting time. Remember, this is the end of the Cold War. It's when there was a supreme sense of optimism almost everywhere that things were going to be doable that hadn't been able to be done before. And in fact, an awful lot has been done. I mean, it's not fully appreciated, but UN peacemaking, UN peacekeeping, UN peace building in post-crisis situations have all come on dramatically. There has been a dramatic reduction in the number of genocides and other mass atrocity crimes that have been occurring. And that was a period in which just everything did seem possible. And that was a lot of fun. And it's still a lot of fun now. I think it's probably the best job in the government, and one that I certainly enjoyed more than any of the others.
Do you feel like some of your achievements or some of the culture that was around the department and when you were Foreign Minister have sort of ossified? It feels like Foreign Affairs has been underpowered since you.
Well, there's always a degree of inherent caution among sort of diplomats. They are inherently professionally cautious. But what I found is when we were taking advantage of the atmosphere in which we found ourselves, we played into that role of Australia as a creative, energetic middle power out there building coalitions, finding problems, solving them. They rose to the occasion magnificently. And the first book I wrote with Bruce Grant about Australian foreign policy, I dedicated to the men and women of the Australian Foreign Service, a much underappreciated national resource, as I said. I think in recent years, I mean, the rot set in, I'm afraid I have to say, I don't want to be too partisan about it, but John Howard's treatment of permanent heads, that first night he came in and sacked a whole lot of people simply because they'd been associated with the Labor Party Labor programs, including Mike Costello as head of Foreign Affairs. Immediately that created a cover your backside sort of attitude among the professionals. And in the absence of big new foreign policy initiatives to get them excited, they realised that professional advancement depended not on being brilliant and creative, but just keeping out of trouble. And that culture has continued.
Was that as significant, that change, as September 11?
No, it didn't have much to do with September 11, I don't think. Everybody's become terribly security conscious and all the rest of it, but and that sort of set of issues has come to centre stage, and the Homeland Security crowd have acquired greater stature in the Canberra pecking order as a result of that, and defence, which has always sort of tried to push foreign affairs to one side, has obviously assumed a bit of significance as well. The intelligence establishment has assumed brand new significance, and understandably so. But all of that doesn't undermine the fact that any self-respecting country of Australia's capacity, I mean, we call ourselves a middle power, but we're a top 20 country in terms of our economy. We've got a bigger economy than Russia's, which most people don't sort of appreciate. And we do have a voice in the world, we have a voice in the region, and we should exercise, we should leverage that power to do a bit more good around the place on the big global public goods issues like disarmament, climate, and obviously the regional issues as well. So,
is there something sort of bubbling along in the world at the moment that you might know about that is going really well?
That's tricky. That's tricky. You'll have to give me a memory jogger on that one. No, I mean, I think, you know, the climate thing is pretty good internationally. The fact that the Americans walking away from that deal, the fact that it didn't spook any of the other players, the fact that in the United States, the states, the cities, you know, said, look, this is nonsense, we're going to jump in and we're going to recognise the reality of these targets and we're going to do it. I mean, I do see, you know, a big international consensus out there to get something done about what is, after all, the other great existential issue along with nuclear weapons. It's only getting that wrong, nuclear weapons wrong, that can destroy life on this planet as we know it.
Oh no, Gareth, climate change is really good.
The unspeakable. The unspeakable. Abbott's Australia, meaner, dumber, hotter.
Yeah.
There are some three-word slogans that deserve a bit more mortality, and I think that's one of them.
You worked with two of the giants, obviously, Hawke and Keating, in ALP leadership and indeed Australian leadership. And I've got a bit of a sense of this from reading the book, but who else would you have liked to have worked for as Foreign Minister if you could have picked another person to have had a crack at the Prime Ministership working in that spirit of things being achievable? Was there anybody there that you think would have done it really, really well that missed out?
Of course, I didn't have the luxury of having Kevin Rudd as a possible option, but that might have been interesting.
Although you defend him considerably.
Well, I do indeed. But look, Hawke and Keating were gold standard Prime Ministers, and even though, you know, Bill Hayden absolutely deserves the recognition he got the other day from Paul Keating. I mean, Paul might have had a bit of a subtext there, but the recognition that, you know, Hayden was an adventurous, capable, principled, you know, value-driven leader. You know, was fine recognition, but Hawke himself and Keating had that extra something that only comes along, you know, once in a generation, I think. It was that capacity to see the big picture and to sustain a sort of a philosophical narrative, long, clear lines of rhetoric, as Keating used to say. The capacity to communicate. In the case of Hawke, with the, you know, community at large, had that incredible sense of connection. Keating perhaps lacked that, but had an incredible capacity to communicate with the opinion leaders in the press gallery, to educate as well as communicate, and to just bring them in eating out of the hand. And they also had a willingness, both of them, which is incredibly important in political leaders, to allow a contest in the government process. Everything was contested, everything was contestable. And I give plenty of examples in this book. I gave even more in the Cabinet Diary published 3 years ago, and people are a bit startled by just how robust some of those exchanges were and how sort of vitriolic they seemed. But at the end of the day, you didn't have anything remotely resembling captain's picks, and any time there was any disposition towards that kind of authoritarian, you know, I'm the one that makes the calls, you know, they faced incredible pushback from a very, very capable, you know, cabinet around the table. And it was a genuinely collective operation in which people had huge amount of respect for each other, huge amount of sort of admiration for each other's values and each other's commitments. And although the brawls, you know, look pretty gothic when you lay out the details of them, and who said what to whom and how crude it often was, you think, my God, how was this operation sustainable? But at the end of the day, there was that collective sense which has been missing, and it was a very, very functional government all the way through. We learnt a lot from the manifest dysfunction of the Whitlam government, just as I hope the current crowd and the Labor Party are learning a lot from the dysfunction of the Rudd-Gillard period. These things do come in cycles. But they were very good leaders, really, really good leaders in their different way. And of course, when they were working together in a complementary fashion, that was the absolute ideal.
Well, that's what I grew up with, and it's what captivated my interest in politics. The problem is that I thought it was always going to be like that. Not that it was always going to be the ALP, no. But that it was always going to be somebody that looked like a Prime Minister, I suppose. You devote a chapter at the end to politics, and talk us through a bit your sense of how things might be put right.
Well, we do have this problem in Australia as elsewhere of decline in confidence in the major parties, the centre-left, the centre-right, the move towards sort of fringe dwellers, sometimes for good idealistic reasons, sometimes for rather crude single-issue reasons. And it's not helping the quality of governance. And what we really do need to do is to ensure that the major parties, the traditional, that give the stability and the capacity to generate substantive policy, we have to ensure that they get back in the game, and I think they're going to have to behave differently from the way they've been behaving. And what I just say is necessary in a very simple nutshell is new listening, new thinking and new acting. New listening is really necessary. I mean, just for so long, those who are being left behind, by not so much globalisation, but by digitalisation, the technological revolution, which has been visible now for quite a few years. People haven't been listening. And when you combine that economic anxiety with the security anxiety, which is where 9/11 cuts in, plus the cultural anxiety that sort of reinforces that when you've got to, looking for reasons for someone to blame. When you've got all these things working, you've really just got to recognise you've got a problem. And so the listening thing is very important. You can't just do a Bertolt Brecht on them and say, let's elect a new people, dissolve the people and elect another. You've got to listen to the one that you've got. Secondly, you've got to do some new thinking, and in particular, above all, in this crucial issue about people's economic uncertainty about the future for them, for their kids, their grandkids, the future of work. And here, I mean, all sorts of bright-eyed, bushy-tailed people are saying, well, every previous industrial revolution going back to the agricultural has generated a massive new jobs, and all the Luddites and the anxieties were totally misplaced, and that will be the case again. This time is, I suspect, very, very different. I mean,
well, in fact, on that issue, you say it's going to require an intelligence that we've never seen in an Australian Parliament.
I mean, the new book that's coming out from Jim Chalmers and Mike Quigley seems to have a lot of very good ideas in it. The idea of universal basic income, which they reject apparently, but is around in international thinking and has to be explored if we, the idea that everybody gets, there's enough income out there. The trouble is there's just not enough people going to have the jobs to be able to generate it, or derive it. Therefore, they've got to have access. Then you run into the problem of sit-down money, so-called, and the whole issue of the dignity of work and the lack of dignity that people feel in not having a job. So you've got to find ways of addressing that, presumably through life education and so on. But this is not easy stuff, and there's a whole bunch of solutions have been proposed. That's what I mean by new thinking. Anyway, we need a lot of it, and it's not just same old, same old. And the new acting part of it really is, I think, a new willingness to have the courage to cooperate, basically, to recognise that there is a bit of good on which the other side of politics is committed to. That doesn't inhibit you staking out your own territory and fighting the elections on your own ideological distinctive ground, because there's enough of those issues around. But overwhelmingly, the disposition has been for the government to say everything the opposition says is rubbish, the opposition to say everything the government says or does is rubbish, and for people to box themselves into very silly corners as a result of that. We've just got to get out of that. And that sense that you're you're losing the affection of your own side, or you're losing the political plot if you acknowledge any decency on the other side. I don't think, we've got a saying in the Labor movement, the mob always works you out. And I think at the end of the day, people have just got to understand that most people in the community don't give a stuff about this, second-rate vaudeville of the parliamentary process and the gamesmanship and the who said what and attacking backwards and forwards. They just want a bit of decency, a bit of good government, and and some differences between which to choose. So I think if we can come up with good storytellers telling a good story on the issues that really are resonating with people, we are capable of recreating a bit of decency and competence in politics, which has been missing in recent years.
There's just not a scintilla of evidence, though, at the moment that there's anyone in the Parliament, really.
Oh, look, no, I won't have that. Again, I'm trying not to be partisan, but,
Well,
I think...
they all say...
No, but look, I think the fact that Bill Shorten initiated some quite serious policy initiatives last time around on negative gearing and superannuation, which everybody said is a potential death trap for you.
Yeah, but you know, and I know, that those policies, whatever their merits may be, are not even close to solving the problems you're talking about with the future of work.
No, but I also...
And he's got all the time in the world in opposition to think about it.
What I would also say, and again, I'm trying not to be puzzled, but I think when you look at the top 15 or 20 on the Labor side of politics, not so evident on the other side, they really are as good as any group of people in coming up in leadership, which is a bit of a mystery to me, because we've seen, for the last 2 or 3 decades, the triumph of the apparatchik in terms of pre-selection processes, and an awful lot of drones and spivs and layabouts have sort of made their way, up through the system on both sides. We have to acknowledge that. But there are some really, really outstanding people there in the Parliament and just itching to get into these big issues. But we've got to create an environment in which that itch can be satisfied with a bit of decent policy and not just this endless constraint. I can't say anything that will, potentially look as though I'm acknowledging some decency on the other side. Energy policy being the classic example for the government at the moment.
I'm not as optimistic as you are, unsurprisingly. You are the optimist in the room. And it's not because I don't... I can see there are people of real calibre there. And on the other side as well. But I don't know why if they're going to sit down and write memoirs, for example, as sitting politicians, why do that? Why not write your treatise on the future of work and put something out there? But instead, no, they're doing it to promote themselves.
Well, again, be fair. I mean, I've just mentioned Jim Chalmers' Mike Quigley's book that's coming out. If you look at Andrew Lee has contributed major writing on a whole bunch of issues. There's Claire O'Neill here in Victoria, and Tim Watts produced a very thoughtful book a year or so ago, squarely focused on policy issues.
I've read every one of these books.
Chris Bowen has written one. Sam Destiari has written one too. But but most of these are serious efforts to generate a policy debate, and we haven't seen that really much in recent decades. And I think it ought to be encouraged.
Yeah, I don't think, as somebody who has read all of them, that they're good enough in terms of pitching at the seriousness, the gravity of what you're describing. You write that in successful conflict resolution, a lot of the time there's no credit, for particularly as a foreign affairs minister. I was wondering if you could give an example in your own working life of something that's just gone under the radar, but that gave you tremendous satisfaction, something that was quietly done.
Well, when I was running International Crisis Group, I think we stopped 2 or 3 wars in Africa by ringing early alarm bells, by doing some very high-level advocacy with the Secretary-General and other key players in New York, and producing evidence-based argument that something was careering off the rails. Now, the whole point about successful prevention is that nothing happens, because you've succeeded in prevention, and therefore nobody notices, and therefore there's not much, credit. But that sort of stuff, and that's one of the reasons, because I'm really pretty familiar with the amount of this sort of activity, not just from my own organisation, but many others, and inside the UN system has been going on. And really, apart from the catastrophe in the Middle East at the moment, which has careered completely off the rails, and we've got an awful lot to explain and worry about there. If you look around the rest of the world, the story is one of quite a dramatic decrease in deadly conflict and in mass atrocity crimes and in major human rights violations, because there's just far more attention being devoted to this stuff and far more people working away at these things than used to be the case before. The whole concept of sovereignty is giving you a sort of a license to kill. Is just gone. I mean, this success we had with this new norm of the responsibility to protect that I had something to do with generating is, again, you see it falling on its face in Syria, and you say, oh, it's all bullshit, it's not making any difference to anybody. But it is making a difference, because over and over again, people are jumping in and addressing these situations. Burundi in Africa has been on the edge of a Rwanda-type volcano for 2 decades now. Exactly the same demographic structure as what exploded in that horrible, horrible genocide in Rwanda next door. But every time, the gas starts coming up and it looks like something imminent is about to happen, it goes straight into the Security Council, and there's an intense round of very active diplomacy. Now, none of this ever gets into the press anywhere, but it's stuff that does give me some sense of confidence that we're not completely dopey in thinking that, these problems are manageable.
Mm. What about the state of the UN at the moment, particularly in regard to Trump?
Well, obviously, you can't talk about the UN without talking about the major players, and the major players in the Security Council in particular. And there is so much disaffection and distrust and distaste for what the Americans are up to at the moment that is making it very, very difficult to get anything done in the Security Council. But nonetheless, people are working away at it. Guterres is approaching the job fairly quietly, just did something the other day which hasn't been done for about 35 years now, and initiated a debate on a particular issue, the Rohingya issue in Southeast Asia, which is quite sensitive for a lot of characters. And he started playing the role that Secretary Generals were always expected to, but haven't in fact done, because they've been spooked by the muscle that's been exercised by the big boys. So there's pushback going on. There's institutional pressures sort of at work. And the spirit of decency, the better angels of our nature are not entirely absent, from the system. A lot of good work is being done.
Just to bring it back to Australia again, the start of your ministerial career, you were Attorney General, which you thought was your dream job until you became Foreign Affairs Minister. With that legal...
I became Attorney General, actually.
Well, it
and
was
ran into a considerable degree of pushback from my colleagues who thought it was all wonderful stuff in opposition, but when I started talking about freedom of information legislation
that's right.
for executive government colleagues, that was not very popular.
Short and painful, you described it
Short
as.
and painful,
yes.
but I gave Hawke the satisfaction at the press club last week of acknowledging after 33 years of outright denial that he was in fact probably right in the interest of the government and my own to sack me as Attorney General and put me into an economic job from which I was able to recover a bit of political ground.
Well, that sort of paternal Hawke too, where, we'll put Gareth somewhere where he won't know everything.
That was absolutely,
and,
the resident know-all was really, really struggling for a time. Very, very good for my psyche, I do acknowledge.
Well, put your know-all hat back on for a minute, and obviously the citizenship saga that's going on at the moment, there are all sorts of constitutional issues. You sounded like somebody who would have liked to have rewritten the entire Constitution if you'd had your way, or big slabs of it. But if you could just change a thing or two, what would be your priorities?
Well, certainly that Section 44 stuff is ludicrously out of date, given the kind of cosmopolitan country we now are, and I do hope the High Court shows a bit of creativity on that front and finds a way through it of the kind that Brandis was suggesting the other day. But I suppose the biggest single thing I would like to see is fixed 4-year term parliaments. I think for all sorts of complicated technical reasons, that is a bit of a solution to the problem of 1975 and an overweening, Senate and everything that goes with that if the Governor-General goes off the rails, but also just having that stability and a slightly longer cycle than the less than 3 years, which has become the norm at the moment, would in itself do a great deal. When I started talking about this years ago, this was a Quixotic and almost unheralded sort of thing. No precedence much around the place at all. Now almost every parliamentary system in the world operates on that basis, and we are laggards in this respect. And I think it just would introduce a bit more stability into the system. You're
quite specific. It's quite simple, the way you'd change it. I understood it, so that was something. Explain it, what it is that would mean, because it doesn't mean there can't ever be an election before that 4-year
No, but it does mean that if the government loses the confidence or whatever of the House, or if there's any reason the government can't be sustained, you have an election only for the duration of the remaining term. So there's very little incentive to destabilise the system or break it apart through internal ructions, to bring a government down. And in these days of increasing probability of, minority governments held in place only by, rather quixotic characters in the corner somewhere, that's an important constraint on the system. You have to work out what you're going to do with the Senate and whether you have the Senate double the House terms or coming out at the same time. If they all came out at the same time, there is a problem about reduced quotas and so on, so an even greater likelihood of quixotic characters taking their place there. It's become a cliche now to talk about the bar scene in Star Wars, but I have to say it still does have some resonance when you look at that Senate at the moment. I'd be prepared to live with 8-year terms and double the terms of the House. But the disincentives to irresponsible behaviour, either by the Governor General or by the Senate.
And so it's interesting your reasons for this actually really still go back to 75. It still concerns you that something like that could happen again?
Well, it concerned me more. It's less of a concern than it has been because there's sort of a new normative understanding has been generated. This is not the stuff that you do. But if we do move to a republic and we do bite the bullet on the method of election of the new head of state, and if, as seems likely, the only model that's ever going to win popular support is a direct election model because it's just too hard to persuade people the virtue of the indirect parliamentary route to that, then you do have a problem, again, of a directly elected person, with all the political authority that arguably goes with that. And if you don't do something about the formal powers in the Constitution or don't find some other complicated way of hedging against the exercise of those powers, you might have a problem in the future, which we don't seem to at the moment.
We're shortly going to open up for questions. So if you'd like to ask Gareth a question, put your hand up and wait for an usher to put a microphone in it. My temperament is not of the cloth from which Zen masters are cut. Says you.
Fairly self-evident proposition. Well, I am quietening down as I get older. And
then, of course, you talk of a need for civility and a sense of humour, and of course, you can have all those things at once. Is it a bit? Is there a dullness? Is there a fragility? Is there something just very different from the kinds of characters that were in the Parliament when you were there today?
No, I think to look back at some sort of golden age is always misplaced. You've got exactly the same spread of people across the political spectrum, and I describe everyone as being able to be located on a single continuum from megalomania at one end to idealism on the other. You can just locate people along that. By megalomania I mean a passion for the business of politics as such and the exercise of power. Whatever the content is, idealism is obviously believing that there are goods out there that you can achieve through that mechanism. But the personalities sort of come and go. The prevailing ethos waxes and wanes, and if the ethos is one of confrontation and boyo aggression and, superficial vaudeville, then it's very hard to get decent policy going, but that doesn't mean there are not decent people in that system with decent policy values and decent commitment to getting good things done. So what's important is to try and, there's some larger-than-life personalities in the past, there's some larger-than-life characters in the Parliament at the moment, and you live with what you've got. And I'm not pessimistic about the quality of the people, particularly, as I said, on my side of politics, despite all the apparatchik stuff of recent years. There's some first-class people there.
Hello. Hi, Gareth.
Hi.
I'm an international relations graduate from ANU.
Great.
So nice to see you. And I work as an environmental campaigner. And my question is pretty simple, really. Basically, as someone that was a prominent figure in the Keating era, do you think that the neoliberal capitalist model championed by Keating and Clinton and Tony Blair, do you think that that's reached its expiry date and it's time for us to radically rethink the systems that we run our world by if we're going to solve some of these major problems that you've mentioned?
Well, the neoliberal stuff with which, people like to currently tar the Hawke Keating government was really only one part of a larger sort of equation and commitment. I mean, the critical character of the Hawke Keating governments and the Blair governments at their best, and they pinched all this from us, was yes, a very disciplined, pro-free market, competitiveness-oriented, productivity-oriented economic set of policies, yes, but that was absolutely matched by a very compassionate, very warm and moist set of social policies. You remember the concept of the social wage, the way in which superannuation policy and Medicare and education policy were all devised with the support of the trade union movement to compensate for the necessary dryness and toughness of the economic model. And if you just do, the hard, dry, ugly economic stuff, and it sometimes is ugly in its implications for individuals, and don't match it with a compensatory, compassionate social policy, then you do have problems. And of course, the third leg was the liberal internationalist foreign policy with a genuine commitment to global public goods, regional public goods, and a belief that we had something to contribute to the achievement of those. And with things like climate change being right up there. I mean, you remember Hawke's initiative to save the Antarctic from mining and oil drilling. I mean, we were out there doing those things. I think within that sort of framework, it's perfectly possible to acknowledge, as many people now are, that deregulation and the hands-off approach to some of these industry policy issues has gone too far, and that you do need the guiding hand of government to reflect the larger public goods, the public interests that are involved, and not just leave all those choices to be made by the economic technocrats or the players in the free market, private market game. And that's the sort of argument we're having now about climate, about energy policy and so on, which and in many parts of the world the pendulum has swung back a bit from that extreme hands-off position, and I think that's entirely appropriate. But it's not inconsistent with the modelling that I've described, and which is one of the really distinctive characters of that Hawke Keating period. And it's what you see again coming through in someone like Macron in France. I mean, God knows whether he's going to survive, given the pushback from the trade union movement and others there about some of the stuff that he's now trying to do on the economic discipline side, which was sadly over necessary in France. But you had that combination of attractive storyteller with an attractive story that touched all those bases. It was economically dry and tough, yes, but also very, very warm in its social dimension and very liberal internationalist, obviously. So, that's, to me, that's the building block, the starting point for getting a bit of decency and sense back into government. I think it is consistent with the kind of concern that you've expressed.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you, Gareth, so much for your discourse this evening. You made some brief reference to the dilemmas of the Middle East, and I wonder if you could expand, perhaps even optimistically, on the situation, particularly in relation to the occupied Palestinian territories in Israel.
Well, the great tragedy of Israel-Palestine is that Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated. I tell the story in the book of a conversation I had with Rabin in Tel Aviv just 3 months before he died, in which I was telling him with my usual chutzpah what he ought to be doing to fix the Palestinian problem, and broke off in sort of midstream and looked across at him with a little smile and said, "But of course I'm preaching to the converted." Rabin steps back, looks at me, and then a little smile on his face. He said, "You're preaching to the committed, not the converted." Mm. And I thought that was absolutely, again, sort of pitch perfect, because he was a Judea, Samaria, Likud sort of a guy, but he knew absolutely the only way peace could be delivered was through making those concessions and compromises to produce a genuine two-state solution, which of course is why he was killed. We haven't had leadership remotely as good as that. on the Israeli side ever since. I think it just has to be acknowledged. Leadership hasn't been too flash on the other side either, but we came incredibly close with Camp David in 2000. I think if Clinton had stayed around for another 6 months, that would have been delivered. Netanyahu, I think, is completely beyond the pale at the moment and just incapable of that larger sense of vision that you just can't have an Israel, which is the traditional Judea and Samaria, plus a Jewish state, plus a democratic state. I mean, if it's going to be a single Israel, it's going to be an apartheid state, as Jimmy Carter and others have said. So that's where I come from on this issue. It's where, Bob Cara and others within my side of politics come from. And I think it's just very important that we continue to beat that two-state drum and hopefully wait for the wheel to sufficiently turn to be able to deliver it. There are wider Middle East issues, of course, with Syria and North Africa, which we can talk about, and there the situation is very fragile, very difficult, but hopefully there's a way through that. If you want to pursue.
Hi Gareth, I'm a Middle Eastern Studies graduate from the ANU. I'm just wondering, in terms of the question about changing the constitution, why you seem to have prioritised parliamentary terms over Indigenous recognition and removing the racist aspects of our constitution.
Well, only because I'm listening to what the Indigenous community is saying. My own instinct is absolutely for some strong recognition language, recognising the custodianship of the land, and I proposed some language which is in the book when I was back in the Parliament, but and similarly, I mean, it's just unconscionable. You've got Section 25 of the Constitution there, which acknowledges the possibility of states continuing to discriminate on the basis of race. And I would have thought that was a pretty high priority. Just whatever else you're doing by way of creating consultative mechanisms and so on, I would have thought there was a pretty high priority to move the constitutional thing forward, but that's not the way the issue has been addressed so far by Indigenous Australians meeting at Uluru and elsewhere, and I think we just simply have to recognise that and exercise a bit of patience while we try and see how over time another approach to this evolves, which touches all the bases and not just some of them. But I mean, I feel very passionately about this issue, as is, I hope, apparent from the book. It goes all the way back to the early days of my public life and the role that I had in the very first land rights stuff up in the Northern Territory, trying to find, in the days of terra nullius, a way through the legal mess that's involved, and the relationships I had with young Aboriginal students and law students and so on. And I tell some pretty sad stories, actually, in the book about that, which were very influential in my own life.
Over 40 years ago, Gareth, I was a student of yours at Melbourne University.
Oh dear.
And during that time, you spoke often of Australia having a Bill of Rights, which you haven't mentioned tonight. I was a bit surprised that you hadn't. I just wonder what your views are today.
Well, my views haven't changed on the absolute necessity of that. Not so much a constitutional Bill of Rights, which is sort of not easily amendable and can be interpreted in loopy ways by the judges, but and then need fixing in a way that can't be fixed. But a statutory Bill of Rights, which at least lays down some very clear parameters, including on the issue of religious freedom and so on, now currently back in play. But it was a very, very hard sell back in those days. I mean, you had the churches almost unanimously coming out against it. I mean, and the most, you probably remember, the arguments were incredibly misconceived, incredibly peculiar. We had no support at all from the Tory side of politics on this, and I look with a certain degree of irony and bemusement at the way in which John Howard and others are now coming out very forcefully for constitutional or other major statutory protections of fundamental liberties, because they're insufficiently protected in the system at the moment. But no, I battled very long and hard. All my initial writing as an academic was on that subject, as you probably remember. A lot of my fulminating and proselytising, you poor bugger, in class was directed, on those same themes. But I really did try very, very hard on that issue, and we actually got a bill brought into the Parliament, and when I was Attorney General. But unfortunately, there wasn't much joy on my side of politics. The Bob Carrs of this world and others said, this is an affront to the democratic parliamentary system, and we won't have a bar of it. And so we are where we are. But please, those of you who do feel that we lack something, like most other parliamentary democracies in the world have some set of rights of this kind enshrined, then please get out and campaign for them.
How ill-advised was Malcolm Turnbull in his confidence interpreting the High Court's reading of the Constitution in the citizenship issue?
Well, it's very, very difficult to read these characters, and I think it's always ill-advised for a political leader to try and anticipate or second-guess, unless it's a very, very sort of clear-cut case. I'm surprised that the decision was apparently as clear-cut as it was on the plebiscite case. There was a very strong argument that was, just not an appropriate bit of funding the way the Constitution was written, and it was easy enough for the High Court to find a way through that. But who knows? I mean, you've either got a court that's sort of willing to be adventurous and do sort of the justice that the occasion seems to demand, or you've got a High Court that retreats to the black letter stuff. And I think the High Court at the moment is a little bit in that latter category, so I wouldn't be terribly optimistic that an intelligent way is found of resolving the citizenship issues under Section 44. I think the intelligent way is to say that if you didn't know, you couldn't reasonably have known, and the first opportunity you took when you did find out that you had another citizenship, you did whatever you could to correct it. I mean, I think that ought to be good enough, and I think any kind of judge worth his or her salt ought to be able to find that kind of principle bedded away in the interstices of that language at the moment, but whether they do or not. And I wouldn't want to be predicting. It's a bit of a mug's game.
That'd be one of the many reasons I'm not a judge. I'd just kick them all out. If you can't fill in a form, if you can't even find out where you're from, get someone else.
But hang on, Sally. I mean, Malcolm Turnbull is right. I mean, 48% of the population was it born overseas or with at least one parent born overseas. We're a different sort of country than the one we used to be, and there's so many ways in which that citizenship thing can come up and bite you on the tail when you just find that you've got it and you didn't think you had it because you weren't born in another country or you'd never been there. And, I think some of these cases really deserve a little bit more compassion of the kind that I would have associated with you.
No, I'm reserving my compassion for other people.
Not for politicians.
I mean, I'm one of those people where I had a parent born overseas, and in fact, the law changed, and I was aware of it. And it's interesting to me that the Labor Party so far haven't been caught up in it simply because they have a better form.
Just a better process. And we absolutely demand of the people.
Which shows it isn't that hard. But anyway.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you very much, Gareth. The future of trade unionism, how do you see trade unions over the next 5-10 years?
Well, it's got to be very hard work for them to sustain their role, just as it's been for the last 20-30 years, in an inexorable decline of people with that sense of solidarity in the workplace, and the sense that by unifying and bonding they can resist the worst excesses. I mean, it probably is the case it's only in the public sector that we're going to see any kind of continued strength in the union movement. There's just too many other pressures out there that are militating against it. I mean, I come from a very strong trade union family, and all my instincts are of that kind. I mean, my dad was a trammy, and his hero, even though, of course, in the abstract, he didn't think communism was wonderful. He loved Clary O'Shea, the union, the extreme communist union leader, because he was wonderful at preserving and protecting the interests of his members. So, I think that sort of tradition does still carry on in the trade union movement, and it's an admirable tradition. And I think, it's a matter of some concern to me that culture of commitment to your union and the solidarity that goes with it is so obviously diminishing. But, with work being organised as it now is, and so many people just jumping from one job to another, it's, in the course of their lifetimes, it's much, much harder than when you have those traditional big manufacturing workplaces or service delivery operations where you could organise people, and where you needed to organise people because the pressures were there. But anyway, it's a bit of a wistful nostalgia, I'm afraid, rather than a prediction of anything very much likely to change.
Someone at the front here. Oh, you've got the front here. Thanks. Just put your hand up again. Yeah.
Thank you, Gareth. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the way social media deals with policies and governments today, as in when you were in government.
Well, obviously the landscape has comprehensively changed, and it's a very much more difficult environment to develop a story and tell a story in policy and political terms in the way we used to be able to do. I mean, Keating used to be able to go up and down the press gallery and talk to the top 15 journalists in the country, and with those extraordinary persuasive skills of his, if he could persuade them to the merits of a particular line, that was what most people heard and responded to. Now, as Catherine Murphy rather, sort of brilliantly put it in a recent Meanjin article, as broadcasting becomes narrowcasting, the social landscape is incredibly occupied by gated housing. Just people just hearing only what they want to hear from the particular media stream they choose to lock into, and not getting that broader perspective. So it is tough, but on the other hand, I firmly believe that at least as much good journalism is being written and read now as was ever the case. And the explanation ought not to become an excuse for politicians. I mean,
you don't blame the media, though. You make it really clear, don't you? The media's not to blame.
I don't think the media is to blame. You've got to live with the media you've got, and in many ways you've got vehicles now for getting, through the links you send out in a tweet, you can get people direct access to more complex arguments, and so you can get the story out. You just got to do it in a different and more sensible way. And to blame the media and say, there's no way we could even begin to tell our story because 24/7 news cycle and the balloon syndrome or the gated community syndrome. I just don't think that's good enough. You live with what you've got and you work with those constraints, and you just shut up periodically. I mean, not a stricture that I always observed myself in government. I hasten to add with those doorstops, but you don't have to feed the media. You don't have to feed it. And the notion that there's a community out there hungry for 5 different stories a day, and they're just hanging on the next thing, and they'll be bored witless if they don't get yet another, story during the day. Don't feed it. Don't feed it, for God's sake. Just let the story build and develop and come at it in a number of different ways. And I think, that wisdom is, if it is wisdom, is beginning to percolate a little bit. And people are just not quite as much prisoners as they have been in the early days of social media. But it's a different universe, and what would I know, an old grey hair like me? It's the future is with the youngsters who know how to address this stuff in a way that I can't begin to imagine.
Well, speaking of the old grey hair, does anyone want to have another crack at our Trivia Pursuit question before we let Gareth go?
No?
No. No. No?
No, because Beasley, he was there the whole time, but he started out as a junior minister, he wasn't in the cabinet. And a lot of them left at one stage or another.
No. No. Gosh, he'd die, wouldn't he, to know that his name has not been called all that
it's
time.
It's in the book, it's in the end notes.
It is in the book, it's in the end notes.
In the end notes, and I'm not going to tell you. You're going to have to buy the book.
I guess I shouldn't either. All right.
I'll tell you at the table up there when I'm signing
That's
this.
a good idea. And the Hill of Content are selling Gareth's book this evening, and he will happily autograph and answer all the trivia you like. It's a really good book, Gareth. Congratulations. It's a delightful mix of great stories and yarns and descriptions of... It's only a couple of people you really seem to loathe, but the descriptions of them are priceless. But there's really...
Only one, really.
Yeah, I thought that they were 2. I wouldn't want to be David Hill from the ABC back in the day. But compared to the other one, I would be, yeah. It's also a very, very serious book, as you can imagine, with real reflections on the policy areas and interests that have always captivated you both in your intellectual pursuits, but in your whole working life. So thanks for coming back to the Fifth Estate and talking about them. You can hear this on a podcast, or for anybody that couldn't make it, also Gareth's previous visits here, his conversation with Greg Sheridan talking about democracy that I referred to at the beginning was a particularly wonderful evening as well. So thank you all for coming, and thank you, Gareth Evans.
Thank you. Thank you, Sally. Thanks for a great interview. Thank you.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.